8. Flower War. Rumbling horns large as New World chestnut trees rocked the very stone of Tepeclan as the representatives of the Empire's provincial kingdoms strode out in small armies onto the cobblestone field of contests. Its rough surface, a mile across, was the core of a grand coliseum as ancient as the mighty temple which overlooked it, the northern flank of Shahuitzul forming the arena's teeming edge. High upon a designated tier of one of the temple's verdant, gardened steps, the heraldry of all the Empire's noble houses fluttered. Patriarchs and matriarchs watched on from the balconies beneath their colors as the sons and clansmen of their houses made for their chosen starting positions, along the edges of the field. Around the lesser walls of the arena, a mass of more than 200,000 cheered into the starry night above, often wearing or waving the colors of their respective provinces. Their gathered calls seemed those of wolves egging on the hunt, eager at the signal for struggle to begin. The field was spectral with cold turquoise light, a system of mirrors set into the shielding roof atop Shahuitzul reflecting the eternal flame's ever-living, ethereal shimmer down upon the combatants. Their gray and obsidian-skinned forms were bare, like the warriors of mythic antiquity, clad only in gold-plated kilts of feathers and silks. This allowed their ritual scarring, opened anew on the night of each flower war, to bleed free down their backs, catching the flickering light of Shahuitzul's flame, or glimmering in the light of the moon newly risen high above. Each pattern displayed the heraldry of their house or city, proud and storied, beneath Tepeclan's ruling Triskelion denoted on the neck. Dozens of noble histories from across the Sholosha'ishan dominion were here unified under one creed, both to pay homage to the old and to look forward to the new. Among them, for the first time, a delegation from reconquered Estlan's temple complex, the newest great city to be added to the Empire, stood ready. Their feline fur coats and agile builds set them apart from their Sholosha'ishan cousins in the faith. But their presence here at the heart of the Empire's traditions spoke to the close ties the Lautani followers of Harakwe had drawn to their new governors in Tepeclan. Present, too, were the fighters of vassals and colonial subjects like the stalwart bull kindred of Manoa, the sleek vulpine sons of Sion, and the keen wolfmen of Volvenreich. A single team from each people represented their kindreds upon the field. Only the hyena-like Kandari, whose boags still refused to raise teams of male warriors for the event, were absent from the field. While these scattered kindreds had dwelt under the sway of the Empire for centuries in some cases, their admittance to the Flower Wars was recent, and marked one of the reigning Tlatoani's many attempts to further integrate the non-Sholosha'ishan folk under the imperial banner. Just as the Inquisition had recast their most warlike gods in the image of the Empire's patron Harakwe, so too would the best-trained sons of Sholoshaidi's imperial corps remind them of the superiority of Sholosha'ishan ways of war. Ichtak was blind to all of this. The singing and cheers from the crowd became a hum of white noise. His lone eye sought only one shape amongst the crowds. "We'll be moving quickly. Bowl through any warriors not from Kushkotlan," Ichtak ordered. "Don't get bogged down with anyone save them." Pochtli and Pokoat, two twin sons of the palace guard who had shadowed him through the Kalmakak Academy, nodded at his right. They flared off to the edges of the wedge into which the Tepeclan contingent had formed, making certain one final time that every soul knew their destination. Shoshut, the brute, strongest in their year, fell back through the formation, eyeing each warrior like a beast sizing prey. Ichtak was glad for their stalwart company, but found himself wishing Akoat could have been at his side. He would have felt more secure with the priest's blade mirroring his own. Tishak, almost comically slight but whip-quick and deadly as a venomous snake, remained just to his right in the wedge, asking, "What other cities might have cause to hunt you?" "Perhaps Milakatlan," Ichtak said. "They've had poor harvests this year, and a farming province can't abide bad produce. A bit of heroism and glory would be a good omen for the folk back home. Harakwe below only knows, though. Could be anyone. I've seen mad rushes during the mock wars, back in the academy." 5-on-1 during the last academy skirmish, Tishak agreed with a grin. "You're lucky you didn't get your skull caved in before graduation. The Kalmakak is a dangerous place for a future Tlatoani." "That's how they make good ones," said Ichtak. Having pressed back up to stand behind him in the ranks, Shoshot's growling tone reached his ears, telling the prince his host was ready. The big warrior thumped his back lightly with the end of his club, saying, "Fight well." "We have only 19 minutes to make our marks," Ichtak reminded them. "Keep the ticking clock on your mind while we move. We'll need to be quick if we're to make those minutes count." As if in time with the prince's words, the prayer began, led by Imperial Bloodletter Shakoat from his perch on the Shahuitsul side of the arena at the Tepeklan team's backs. The artfully crafted Colosseum, aided by the canyon walls of Tepeklan itself, carried his booming voice to every ear. The audience muttered their responses in turn, their massed mantras making the night air hum. The warriors below stayed silent, each mentally steeling themselves for the barely contained chaos which lay ahead, each measuring out the distance to this or that rival city or personal foe upon the field. "No hesitation," Ichtak said, more to himself than to those close enough to hear him. "Not one step back." The night air reverberated with the arena's horns once more, and to a man, every gathered warrior bolted like loosed hounds for their chosen prey. Ichtak was first to move, and with the practiced unit's sympathy forged in them by the Kalmakak Academy's brutal instructors, the 190 men representing Tepeklan followed in his wake. Their formation, an arrowhead scything across the stone floor of the arena, was not alone, with every city's contingent marking their own routes and making to settle old scores. Groups had often been arranged with this purpose in mind, ensuring that two cities or warriors famously at odds with each other were the furthest apart. This, in turn, ensured the field became a chaotic scramble as dozens of formations wheeled for one another, scrambled around or through one another, and inevitably collided in bone-jarring contest with one another. Tepeklan's contingent swung wide around a formation from the city of Teoatlan before passing a contingent from Tlaxcatlan. The flanks of their groups clattered against one another as they passed, with weapon strikes meant to dissuade more than to injure whenever their warriors came too close. In this way, the first minutes of the Flower War were as Ichtak had always seen them, with assorted formations moving as single organisms towards objectives only their commanders had eyes for. The crest of feathers upon his shoulders meant to denote his rank made him visible to not only his retinue, but to every warrior on the field, and he knew it would not be long before groups looking to make a name for themselves sought him out. Ichtak maneuvered his men as best he could, seeking to mitigate the energy they would have to spend rebuffing unwanted combats as much as possible, their spearhead folding in at the rear tips whenever a gap between formations needed to be threaded without getting tangled up in a melee. Then he spotted the king of Mechintlan's retinue, wheeling out under their violet banner between the distant formation of Kushkotlan and his own, and he knew this would not be a clean approach. There was no getting around them. The men from Mechintlan were coming for them, and Ichtak's Tepeklan contingent would have to cut a way through if they wanted their fight with Kushkotlan. "Break them." Ichtak's words were likely lost to the din of the clashing cities around them, but the prince accentuated the order by quickening his pace, with the spearhead behind him matching each footfall. His Maquahuit came out to his side, held ready to strike. The grand commons at Estlan flashed through his mind, and he had a moment to be glad this was a contest of martial skill rather than one of modern arms. No rifles or artillery pieces cracked here, only bones. Michintlan's lord was his target, for the older warrior must have chosen this contest to try his might against the future Tlatoani. Ichtak meant to give him what he wanted. Tepeklan's formation crashed tip-first into the Michintlan phalanx's heart, its spearhead shape flattening and then partially enveloping the Michintlan square with its rear edges, the twins Pochtli and Pokoat directing from the rear, ensuring every subtle shift went according to plan. Ichtak, the first into contact, was so brutal in his momentum that the strikes he used to ward off the fending spear of this lesser king drove the older warrior stumbling back into the ranks of his men. The prince was hot on his heels, with the giant Shoshot cracking femurs and breaking ribs off to his side, fending off any from the ranks who drew too close to the dueling royals. The stink of blood on the air and the first yelps of the wounded dragged any who still thought this a game into reality, and the half-enveloped Michintlan contingent fought with the rage of cornered beasts. Ichtak's Maquahuit, a wood and obsidian construction made in the ancient style for the purpose of the flower war rather than his familiar Maquahuit of steel, flaked shards of the razor-sharp stone as he raked the haft of his enemy's spear, cruelly gouging the king's hand. The king's initial advantage of reach had been spent during the crash of the formations, and now that the brawl had begun, he was having difficulty bringing the long weapon to bear. The prince, pressing in on his injured foe, grabbed the spear and yanked it out wide before bringing down the hilt of his toothy blade on the king's skull, sending him sprawling to the stone. A roar of approval came up from the observing crowds. More arose as other contests between feather-crested contingent leaders were decided here and there across the arena out of Ichtak's sight. They intermingled with the shouts of agony and exultation stalking the bloodied stone down the combat grounds. The prince drank it in, warding off the men of Michintlan as he stepped past their downed leader, looking for more challengers. In his wake, his warriors gathered up the king and ushered the high-value prisoner back to the core of their formation. Just as in Estlan, he felt a paradoxical ease here, at once jolted with adrenaline and collected in meditative calm. This contained slice of the world was physically grueling, but in schematic it was simple. There was no future to worry about here save the sword's swing or the hammer's fall. There was only the struggle of the moment. Several precious minutes ticked by, with opponents coming forward from the chaos and being dispatched. Ichtak received a minor tear along his calf from a glancing slash from a passing Maquahuit, but the man who had dealt it out was soon knocked flat by Tishak. They were beginning to take a serious toll on the Michintlan contingent. The fallen, wounded, and stunned were being trodden upon, gasping for air upon the bloodied cobbles beneath their backs, and the mood of their fighting was growing hopeless. The death knell sounded for them when the Kushkotlan formation, having continued its obsessed charge through the arena to catch them, slammed into the exposed rear ranks of the Michintlan phalanx, and began to carve its way through to their true targets. "With me," Ichtak called to Shoshot and Tishak, pressing forward through the mob, arms trembling from the strain of each exhausted blow. Ichtak and the forward ranks of the Tepeklan warriors saw the Michintlan men melt away before them as those still standing fell prone in surrender, or crawled out of the confusion to lie hurting on the stone. Then, before he had time to process the change, he was face to face with what had to be Prince Thunkoat, looming and crested with the feathers of rank. Ichtak was, as so many of his line, very large for a Sholosha'ishan, 6.5 feet tall, and with a broad, powerful build. But Thunkoat was a true giant. the only living Sholosha'ishan Ichtak had ever seen that surpassed him in size. The Prince of Kushkotlan was a full head taller than the Prince of Tepeklan, and in the years since Ichtak's first passing meeting with him as a teenager, the dawning of Thuncoat's 20s had seen the already formidable young man hone every limb and contour of himself into a tuned machine of sinew, wrought only for the drawing of blood. Jet black against the shadow of the night and with gold eyes that seemed to spark with the distant fires of the arena, Thuncoat seemed some specter summoned up to do him harm. Ichtak had only a second's frenzied observation to take the measure of his foe, but that was more than enough to tell him he had been right to train hard for their eventual reunion. If he had imagined this would be a theatric, measured duel, he was wrong. There were no shouted challenges or frenzied insults. Thuncoat brought his hammer, an elegantly carved yet monstrous stone head on a pristine haft of banded oak, up high. He was upon Ichtak before so much as a glare could pass between them. Ichtak, forced to parry the blow rather than avoid it by the sheer ferocity of the charge, nearly buckled under the force of the impact. The haft of the hammer sent shards of his Makwahweed's obsidian teeth raining down over him, and in the confusion following the strike, Thuncoat used his momentum to plant his knee into Ichtak's exposed stomach. It was not a squarely landed hit, but it threw Ichtak off balance all the same, sending him stumbling backward away from his opponent. Shoshot, fighting some other challenger to his side, had the presence of mind to halt Ichtak's stumble with his shoulder, nudging Tepeklan's prince back onto his feet and towards his counterpart from Kushkotlan. Ichtak was thankful for the assistance, but any acknowledgement of his old friend's aid was lost in the midst of his excitement for the struggle. Already weary from a dozen lesser battles, the looming Thuncoat would prove more dangerous than any who had come before him. It was exactly the kind of challenge Ichtak had been waiting for. When Thuncoat came in swinging again, Ichtak was a bit more collected, his breaths measured and his movements calculated. Like a dancer locked in improvisational step, he moved around his opponent as best the clattering combat around them allowed, attempting to avoid more strikes than he blocked. The count of fragile obsidian teeth on his wooden Makwahweed was growing ever smaller as blows were traded with the heavy hammer, and he wanted to make them count. Thuncoat, for his part, weaved after him with a burning wrath that was masterfully harnessed, striking hard, but never so hard that he left himself overinvested or exposed. Their retinues, even distracted by their own battles, kept an eye ever on the dueling princes, waiting to see a decisive blow struck. Minutes into this dance, Ichtak believed he had made just such a blow when, after sidestepping a downward swipe from Thuncoat, he caught the hammer's head against the stone ground with his Makwahweed. This was the mistake he'd been waiting for, the confidence of the spider finally coming back around to bite it. Keeping his weight pressed down upon his enemy's weapon, he landed a bone-rattling shin with flexible grace on his opponent's exposed ribcage, staggering him. As Thuncoat reeled back from the hit, catching his breath and jerking to raise his pinned hammer, Ichtak brought up his Makwahweed in a rising slash. It tore along the flesh of Thuncoat's chest, leaving a wet gash through the onyx skin of his torso. Ruhualpa's words had been heeded, Ichtak thought. With the brute having left himself open to a painful wound, the fight was all but won. Thuncoat would be back on his heels now, his confidence dampened. But for all Ichtak's coordination and cleverness, Thuncoat, for his part, did not so much as grunt. He remained absolutely silent, blind to the searing pain of the gash and the agony in his ribs, focused only upon his foe. So certain was Ichtak that he had just made a winning move, he was not prepared for the speed with which Thuncoat went into a swing of his own, capitalizing on Ichtak's upward momentum to sweep at his exposed legs. Tepeklan's prince lurched back, but not fast enough, and the hammer's haft caught the meat of his calf, sending him tumbling backwards to the cobblestones. No bones had broken, Ichtak thought, but the strike was enough. He was on his back, and even as he shifted away and prepared to leap to his feet, he was certain the end had come. Thuncoat stalked forward 2 long paces, raising his hammer to knock him senseless with the haft's end and carry the duel. Ichtak, grasping blind to his side, had only just closed his grip around the familiar handle of his dropped makwawit. There was too little space between them, too few seconds to bring home a parrying strike as he rose and knocked whatever finishing blow was coming aside. He gritted his teeth and began to move, determined to be stricken down in motion rather than lay still and take the hit. Akoat had been right in their sparring. He should have expected more of so renowned a fighter. Now he had become the prey. Then, sudden as their initial booming call, the horns sounded. 19 minutes had passed. The color drained from Thuncoat's ebon features, and his pointed ears flattened, freezing him in place with hammer raised, realization setting in. Ichtak could not help but feel for him. "I had you," Thuncoat said, the muttered words as much to himself as to the fallen Ichtak. Ichtak nodded, staggering to his feet, his strained leg hesitant to support his weight. "You did," he said. "The clock cheated you." He was not happy to have been defeated. It would be the first such defeat for many years, since his instructors at the Kalmakak Academy had learned the hard way not to get rough with their early teenage prince in the sparring pits. Still, he would not pretend it had not happened. Ichtak looked off to the crowds, counting their chosen team's victories and arguing amongst themselves about the results. When Ichtak's gaze returned to meet Thuncoat's, the Prince of Kushkotlan was looking off towards the crowds beneath his city's banners along the Colosseum walls. They both stood in silence, their wounded, exhausted retinues gathering themselves and rising from the bloody stone all around them. "They might not know it," Ichtak said, "but we know it." Thuncoat turned to face him, his features softened a bit, suddenly not the steely murderer he had seemed just minutes ago. "I suppose. A good contest, though." The Prince of Kushkotlan ran a finger through the blood still streaming from the long gash across his chest, holding it up as if to attest to the fact. "I can only wonder what it would have been like if Michintlan had not slowed you down." "Hopefully we'll find out next spring," said Ichtak. Thuncoat returned the grin he gave him. Thuncoat turned to a warrior just to his right, who had been fighting Tishak to a standstill before the horn's call, and nudged his shoulder. "I like him.